everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Dissecting Fiction with me, Christiaan, and just me this time around. Vinny is not going to be here for this episode because I'm going to be talking about the rather complicated Xeno series. As some of you might know, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition recently came out. What is not as well known is that Xenoblade Chronicles is part of a larger Xeno series. The names differ each time, but generally Xenoblade Chronicles only has one direct sequel, but the Xeno series has about 7 mainline games. You can kind of see this with Xenoblade Chronicles, and then what comes afterwards is Xenoblade Chronicles X. But Xenoblade Chronicles X kind of has nothing to do with Xenoblade Chronicles 1, and I'll get into the reasons why behind that, but why they're all considered part of the same series. To simplify it a bit, the Xeno meta-series is called a meta-series because all 7 games share very similar motifs, combat, and themes. But the main reason that connects all of them is that they all have very similar creative teams, and they're all looked over by some way by a man named Tetsuya Takahashi, who's generally either director or the executive producer of each of these games. And then each of these games also has very similar staff on each of them. There's other recognizable things across these series, such as motifs. For example, there is a thing in each of these games called either the Zohar or the Conduit. And it's like a cross-like shape that appears in each of the games, and in each of the games they generally do different things. It's like an energy conductor, but sometimes it's like a crystal, sometimes it's a space pod. It changes each time. And then the other thing that connects all these games is that all of them are sci-fi JRPGs, but more of a science fantasy, where a lot of the characters can use magic, much like Star Wars, where Star Wars has science element technically, where everybody's in space, but everybody has magic powers. That's the short of it, that each of these games are generally directed by the same people. But there is a much larger, much more interesting history behind each of these games, in that the Xeno meta-series has been a part of a lot of shifts in the video game industry, interestingly enough, and has been a core part of a lot of changes, especially across console generations. So stick around and find out. I think it's a really fascinating story, and a lot of these games are actually some of my favorite games of all time. I think the Xeno series tends to explore very complicated themes about God and religion and metaphysics that a lot of other games are unable to explore for various different reasons, but the Xeno series does an excellent job of really making you question things and really exploring things in a very deep manner. So the first game in the Xeno meta-series is Xenogears, developed by Square, which was what Square Enix was before it became Square Enix for the PlayStation 1. The early ideas of Xenogears started around 95-96. Takahashi was a designer for the Final Fantasy series, designing Magitech armor for Final Fantasy VI. As the PlayStation 1 was coming out, Square wanted to develop a kind of complex game to kind of push the system, since they had a close partnership with Sony at the time. And that complex game was, in their mind, going to be Final Fantasy VII. Before I go much further, I want to say there's a lot of Japanese names in this, so if I mispronounce anything, please forgive me, and you can yell at me in the comments below. So Takahashi and his writing partner and future wife, who I'll be referring to as Soria Saga, her real name is Koya Tanaka, but to keep things simple, I'll be calling her Saga from here on out, originally pitched Xenogears to Square, hoping it would become Final Fantasy VII. But the executives at Square thought the game was far too complex and dark to be a Final Fantasy game, which I guess says a lot about Xenogears, because Final Fantasy VII is complex. Xenogears is far more convoluted than even Final Fantasy VII, which is kind of daunting to even say. But Square was interested in the ideas that Takahashi and Saga were coming up with, so Square allowed them to further develop the concept. In its earliest stages, Xenogears was being developed as a sequel to Chrono Trigger, but that idea was kind of scrapped due to creative conflicts Takahashi was having with the staff on what would become Chrono Cross, because Takahashi wanted a more sci-fi based game. So eventually Square allowed Takahashi to kind of develop it into its own franchise and its own game, which to me I think is kind of amazing that Takahashi is able to kind of have that kind of swing. You'll see that a lot throughout the story, that Takahashi has a lot of friends in high places. So Takahashi, as he was beginning to make this game, brought on a couple of people that are going to be recurring throughout this narrative. Takahashi brought on Yasuhaki Hone as art director, Kunihiko Tanaka as character designer, Yasunori Mitsuda as a musical composer. This game wanted to explore complicated questions about life and death, of where we come from and where we go, and Takahashi and Saga were going to explore this through their shared interests of Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, and Friedrich Nietzsche. As you can see, this is already rooted in very deep philosophical and even religious psychological themes. Because of this, the game had a lot of really complex religious imagery and even really loaded religious imagery. Kind of think it in a similar vein as Neon Genesis Evangelion, which was what inspired Takahashi and Saga to make this game in the first place. But they really wanted to be able to question religion and the concept of God or gods. This concept quickly ballooned into a very complicated 6-part story that detailed events over multiple millennia and multiple planets. Xenogears was going to be part 5 in this 6-part saga. The other 4 parts were referenced in the game and they are explained in the game, but they would not be fully timelined and explained until the Xenogears Perfect Works art book that came out years later. Eventually, with all the design documents off the floor, Xenogears went through a kind of difficult 2-year development as they only had a 30-man team that was fairly inexperienced trying to develop a game for the PlayStation, which was a fairly new system. And in the early PlayStation era, a lot of games were having difficulty trying to figure out how to make a game that works in 3D, because up to this point, everything was in 2D or 2.5D. So they made some interesting decisions. For example, Takashi had Tanaka, the character designer, create several anime cutscenes. This is partly to help save space on the PlayStation 1 disc, because they did not have enough room to actually create all the 3D cutscenes, but also because they did not believe the 3D cutscenes would be narratively cohesive to what they wanted to explain and what they wanted to show. So Tanaka was able to develop some short anime sequences throughout the game. And they're actually pretty good. They're very 90s anime, so a lot of shoulder pads, a lot of long hair. It's this really cool design. Saga, meanwhile, she had the second disc mainly told through narration and cutscenes, because they wanted to keep the story intact, but they were quickly finding out they were running out of both space on the disc, and they were also running into deadlines, that they would not be able to fully show what they wanted to do in the time for deadline. So Saga made the kind of controversial decision that the second disc would mostly be narration and cutscenes, which I personally enjoy because it makes the story very fast, but it also glosses over a lot of stuff. And after the 2 years, Xenosaga was eventually released in Japan on February 11th, 1998, and then in America on October 20th, 1998. Xenogears follows the story of Fei Fong Wong, a young boy in a remote village that is suddenly embroiled in a conflict against the shadowy organization as he attempts to uncover mysteries about himself and his world. That's a pretty shorthand of it. A lot more happens in that story, but that's the log line of the game. Xenogears almost wasn't localized because of all the religious themes and psychological themes it had throughout it. The only reason it came to the West was because of a man named Richard Honeywood, who worked very closely with Squares and the Xenogears dev team to make sure the translation was very close to the original script without offending certain religious groups. Because again, they had ideas about Jesus and crucifixions and things like that, and it would have probably landed poorly in the West if he tried to keep everything as a literal translation. But because Richard Honeywood was there working with the teams, he was able to help steer them away from using too much loaded imagery. But because of all this religious imagery, Square was quite worried that it wouldn't work in the West, so they released it with very little press, but it became very quickly a very big cult and financial success because of all the good press it was getting, thanks to its narrative complex themes. You can kind of see the critical success it was getting later on in the mid-2000s when Xenogears was placing in a lot of the top 100 best games ever made list in about the mid-2000s. It was usually around the 50s, but it was usually generally placed for its narrative, not so much the combat, but its ability to push storytelling inside video games. For me, Xenogears is probably one of my favorite games. I wouldn't say it is in the top 10 because the second disc is kind of complicated and things start to happen very fast. But I really love the story. If you really love like Neon Genesis Evangelion, then Xenogears is like perfect because it plays a lot with the religious imagery and very complex ideas. But unlike Neon Genesis Evangelion, where they kind of throw in a lot of religious imagery without really exploring it, Xenogears does a lot of work of trying to be accurate to a lot of religious themes and ideas. For example, there's a thing in Jewish Kabbalism called the Merkava, and the Merkava is basically the chariot of God. Now in Xenogears, they use the Merkava as a reference to the spaceships, or several spaceships, that carry the main villain in the game. And I find those kinds of parallels like very interesting, and it helps add a lot of depth to the game. And it's hard to explain like where this story goes without getting into spoilers. I want to try to avoid spoilers as much as possible when explaining these games because I do think these stories take a lot of complicated twists and a lot of interesting twists that are really worth looking into. Now, off of the success of Xenogears, Takahashi pushed for a sequel, but Xenogears came after Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy VII was like an unmitigated success for Square. So Square at that point was pretty committed to making another Final Fantasy game instead of making more Xenogears games or more Chrono Trigger games, because those were kind of not as financially or critically successful as those games, and they could kind of see that they had a whole franchise just out of this one Final Fantasy VII game. So by 1999, Takahashi and several of the employees at Square felt very frustrated with the company's sudden shift in focus, and they felt that creativity was being stifled because before this, Square was very willing to kind of invest in a lot of different games and see where things go, but suddenly they wanted just Final Fantasy. And there's a lot of complicated reasons behind that. If we ever do a Final Fantasy podcast, we'll get into that. In a conversation with fellow employees talking about their frustrations, Takahashi decided to leave Square and make his own game studio called Monolith Soft, alongside Yusuke Han, the art director, and Haruhito Sugurai, and these three guys decided to make Monolith Soft. Interesting enough, a lot of people were leaving Square at this time because they felt that Square was focusing too much on Final Fantasy at this point. But because of this, Takahashi was looking for a new studio to work under. Even though he had his own game studio, he needed a publisher to help publish the games. This was before the days of Steam, all these online game stores that you could just release games onto. You needed a publisher back then to physically print the game disc so people could actually play them. So Haruhito Sugurai and Takahashi were able to kind of talk to a couple of studios, but the big studio that was interested in them was Namco. Because Namco's CEO and founder was very interested in Takahashi's really lofty ideas and dreams about what video games could be narratively and gameplay-wise. So the CEO and founder of Namco brought them in a pretty unprecedented deal that Namco would take on all the logistics, all the financial side burdens of it, while Monolith Soft was just able to produce the game they wanted. Under Namco, now, Takahashi and Monolith Soft would begin work on what would become known as Xenosaga. But Xenosaga was kind of envisioned to be a reimagining of what Xenogears would be. So when they started development, Takahashi brought back basically everybody that worked on Xenogears with him into this new project. Han returned as art director, Saga returned as writer, Tanaka returned as character designer, and Mitsuda returned as musical composer. All of them in very similar positions as they were working in Xenogears, but now they had the experience to back up what they wanted Xenogears to be in Xenosaga. This was supposed to be the grand vision they originally had for Xenogears brought to life. And when they originally pitched this, Xenosaga was going to be an epic 6-part game series that was going to have the full design document they wanted for Xenogears. It's pretty grand in scale. This meant that a lot of characters from Xenogears are kind of showing up again in Xenosaga. They were designed differently and they had slightly different names, but they were basically the same characters. They even have very similar character arcs. And they also altered the setting into a much more science fiction setting. They had a lot of robots, a lot of virtual reality, a lot of AI stuff that Xenogears didn't quite have. Xenosaga Episode 1 faced a lot of difficult developments again because despite having a larger studio and the full backing of Namco, and even having access to a motion capturing studio, most of the crew on Xenosaga was fairly new and they were struggling to work on the PlayStation 2 engine and create the kind of epic 3D environments, models, and cutscenes that Takahashi really wanted for Xenosaga. Because of this, Xenosaga was pretty graphically advanced for his time, kind of on the scale of Metal Gear Solid 2, but that would cause some problems later down the line for the whole series. After being 2 years in development, Xenosaga Episode 1, Der Wille zur Macht, released in Japan in 2002, and then in America in 2003. Xenosaga really pushed the religious and philosophical themes of Xenogears, with the title Der Wille zur Macht being a literal translation of The Will to Power, a book by Friedrich Nietzsche. Again, excuse me for pronouncing all these names wrong. There are, as you can kind of tell, I can barely speak English, let alone foreign languages. The story of Xenosaga takes 4,000 years in the future where humanity has achieved space flight after discovering an object called the Zohar on Earth. Humanity was able to colonize the galaxy as they willed, and the location of Earth was suddenly lost after a mysterious event, and Earth afterwards would be referred to as Lost Jerusalem. Most of the story follows Shion Yuzuki, who is an original character to Xenosaga, and her story is about her building and testing an advanced combat robot named Cosmos. Cosmos is programmed to fight an interdimensional race of energy beings called the Gnosis. After attacked by the Gnosis, Shion is forced to confront a conspiracy at the heart of the universe. The initial release of Episode 1 was, frankly, enough of a success that Namco supported the series pretty heavily. A manga was developed, an anime was made, and 2 expansions called Xenosaga Freaks and Xenosaga Pied Piper were released to tide over fans until Episode 2 could come out. When development on Episode 2 started, Takahashi chose to step down from being the game director to allow new, fresher faces to kind of come up and fill in the void, because he wanted to kind of train the studio to be a very flexible staff and a very veteran staff, because they were hoping to become a core studio of Namco's roster. This saw a lot of changes, like a lot of really drastic changes, and there's probably a lot of behind-the-scenes reasons why Namco was going through a lot of changes at this time, as for many game studios. But the biggest of which was that Xenosaga went from being a 6-game series to only 3. Of course, Takahashi and Saga were overseeing all of this, but they had to do huge revisions to the story they originally wanted to tell. On top of this, Xenosaga's game models were revised from the much more anime aesthetic to more realistic style. And you can really see that in the game covers. Xenosaga 2 has much more angular designs, and the eyes are not so as white. And they made some minor combat changes, streamlined things a little bit. And then they also changed over most of the voice actors for some reason. Xenosaga Episode 2, excuse me as I butcher this subtitle, Xenosaga Episode 2, Den Zus von Gut und Böse, translating to Beyond Good and Evil, another Friedrich Nietzsche reference, was released in Japan in 2004 and America in 2005. Episode 2 performance fiscally was very poor, and it barely reached even like 50% of its target goals, both in Japan and overseas. And I think I'll get into why I think that happened. The staff after Episode 2, they also began development on Episode 3 with the intent to close the series by this point. Also, around this time, a lot of the key creators that started Xenosaga, Tanahaka, Saga, Hon, no longer really had direct involvement in Xenosaga, and they were instead working on other projects within the video game industry. The staff, by the time Episode 3 rolled around, were veterans, and they were able to develop Episode 3 extremely quickly. Our larger goal of Xenosaga Episode 3 was to give everything a pretty satisfying conclusion, while also addressing a lot of the criticism from the first 2 games. This included kind of changing the models once again, but also bringing back all the voice actors from the first game for the 3rd game. Xenosaga Episode 3, also Sprach Zarathustra, was released internationally in 2006. Episode 3 was never released in Europe for reasons I don't quite know why, and I could never really find out why. I'm can only guess is because they did not think it was financially feasible to do it. This game, Episode 3, sold slightly worse than Episode 2, which is pretty bad, but the series as a whole still held generally good reviews from critics at this time. So Xenosaga is a complicated series. Again, I still quite like it. This time it pushes the themes I really enjoyed in Xenogears about God and religion and how people approach religion, and even like obscure religious factions like Kabbalism and Gnosticism in a really interesting way. And it even uses a lot of this religious imagery very correctly and explores the idea of like nihilism, faith, and even reincarnation. And I really appreciate the games for that. I think the series of Xenosaga fell victim to a lot of changing game design at the time. If PlayStation 1 was people figuring out how to work in 3D environments, PlayStation 2 was a lot of people really understanding how to work in those 3D environments and perfecting it. Xenosaga kind of fell victim to the changing tides of what would be the video game industry, in that from about 2001 to about 2006, a lot changed over very quickly. People were not interested in turn-based combat. They wanted more action combat. A lot of shooters becoming very popular around this time. Halo, for example. So people were just not interested in this kind of game. And people were really interested in high graphical quality games like Halo that really had really complex environments, and Xenosaga wasn't really about that. Xenosaga was more about narratives, and was more about kind of like accurate game models, and a lot of its environments felt very stiff, and a lot of its combat felt very stiff. So I think ultimately Xenosaga, despite Episode 1 selling very well, because I believe it was a launch title for the PS2, and usually when a game launches with a game system, it sells generally well. And especially since this was a new series being pushed heavily by Namco, Xenosaga Episode 1 sold very well, but interest quickly waned after that because suddenly shooters were very popular. RPGs was no longer the hot thing. Which is unfortunate because I think Xenosaga is a very interesting and complex game with a lot of cool character designs. Cosmos, for example, is a very iconic design, if not obscure, and it deals with a lot of really cool themes. The combat, the gameplay is not the greatest, but it makes a lot of improvements upon what they were seeing with Xenogears. So after the release of Episode 3, Monolith Soft was in a pretty demoralized state because Xenosaga, despite having some critical fans, sold very poorly. And in 2006, Takahashi hoped to boost morale by heading straight into a new project, based on an idea he vaguely had about people living on the bodies of massive god-like beings. This idea struck a chord with Hon, who was still a CEO and executive producer of Monolith Soft, and he, on a very spur of the moment, decided to build 2 3D models of these gods fighting to help visualize the concept. And this is so they can kind of see like where would the people live on the bodies of these gods. Takahashi and Hon also worked very closely with the staff to flesh out this idea, taking kind of abandoned game ideas they had, and putting them into this freshly developing and germinating concept. So that had something very smooth and, I guess, good, to be simple about it. With this new idea, Monolith Soft was kind of looking to break away from Namco, which was becoming Bandai Namco at this point. Namco lost its CEO and founder pretty early on in Xenosaga's development, and that's partly why Xenosaga fell on such hard times so quickly, is because Namco did not see any financial gain in making the Xenosaga series, because, as I said in Episode 1, they developed a lot of side media for Xenosaga 1. But by the time Episode 2 came out, they didn't really help promote it in any way. They didn't promote in game magazines. They didn't promote on websites. And because of that, Namco's belief that the game sold poorly manifested in of itself. You see this a lot in the movie industry too. If you don't advertise something, nobody knows about it, and it doesn't sell well. But after this retirement of the Namco CEO and founder, Namco would merge with Bandai, and the entire company direction changed. They wanted less of these unique games and more commercially viable games. So as Monolith Soft was developing this idea, they were trying to break away from Namco because they believed the direction of Bandai Namco was counterintuitive to what they wanted to be, and they thought Bandai Namco was harming their studio. And during this time, Monolith Soft approached a Nintendo executive about what they should do. And the Nintendo executive was, from what I could tell, very frank with them, and he told them that they should continue creating their own original ideas. But because of this, Nintendo suddenly had a very close partnership with Monolith Soft. In 2007, after presenting some of the ideas to Nintendo would buy 80% of Monolith Soft's stock, while Bandai Namco retained only 16% of this. Takahashi and Honda would present Nintendo their new concept about gods in 2007, while also developing some smaller titles from the company. These were kind of like shovelware games to kind of get their feet wet on Nintendo's new system, the Wii and the DS. Monolith Soft was able to really familiarize themselves with the Nintendo Wii's hardware limits and its hardware abilities. Ko Kojima, who developed these Monolith Soft Wii titles, was suddenly put in the direction to direct this new developing project for Monolith Soft. Nintendo would also later add Genki Yokata as a co-director who would help guide the development for this kind of new studio and this kind of, frankly, what was becoming a pretty big idea for Monolith Soft. Again, you can kind of see this lofty dreams of Takahashi of what his games could be. Throughout the whole cycle, Takahashi was very involved with developing this title. Again, he was the one that came up with the concept, and even though he wasn't directing, he was there for every single step, all the way up to debugging mode. This concept that Takahashi was developing suddenly had a new title called Monado Beginning of the World. But before Monado Beginning of the World was released, Satoru Iwata, CEO of Nintendo, changed the title to Xenoblade Chronicles in order to show the world that this is something from a kind of a legendary studio at this point and a legendary creator. And I think changing the name to Xenoblade Chronicles set something in motion for the franchise as a whole and is what really caused this meta series to develop. Due to the criticism of their previous games of being old-fashioned, Takahashi sought to really focus on the combat first instead of the story. And this is kind of a unique thing to focus on because suddenly Monolith Soft, which was known for their very narratively complex games, was focusing on combat first and foremost. Taking inspiration from East and West, Takahashi wanted a open-world game that rewarded exploration. Open world was kind of a new developing concept, but it was very popular at this time. Takahashi would hire Yuchihiro Takada, who wrote the Xenosaga anime for episode 1, and Yuri Hatari, a game planner for Nintendo. She was a producer that helped develop things like the Kirby games in the mid-2000s, to really develop the story and concept while he got involved with the combat and exploration side. This was really to ensure that Takahashi wouldn't suddenly somehow involve himself with the story and make it too complex, because he wanted two writers that came not from the video game industry, but from the more cinematic world of anime and even the more business side of Nintendo production to really make this game really accessible and something that people can kind of really connect to. He really wanted something that wasn't gamey. He wanted something that could be appreciated by people that were not very into video games. But because of Takada and Hatari's involvement, the game went into a great focus about really developing its characters and making them very relatable and likable to new players and old players, instead of really making this narrative complex story. During this development, Takahashi also hired Yoko Shimomura. Oh my god, I really butchered that. The composers for series like Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy XV to develop the soundtrack for Xenoblade Chronicles, which I think is an excellent choice. The Xenoblade Chronicles soundtrack is godlike. So with everything in motion, Xenoblade Chronicles was released in Japan in 2010, released in Europe in 2011, and in America in 2012. The staggered release was due to Nintendo originally having no plans to release Xenoblade in Western markets. But there was this fan initiative called Project Rainfall, and it took place to bring Xenoblade Chronicles, The Last Story, and Pandora's Towers to Western market. All three games were Wii games that Nintendo really had no interest in bringing over to the West. This initiative was done through fan petitions, emails, and pre-ordering the title at retailers. This is also during a time where you can just kind of pre-order things by calling GameStop and saying, I want X game, and they would just write it down somewhere and you would suddenly have X game. Suddenly, Xenoblade Chronicles, at this time called Monado, became the #1 pre-ordered game on Amazon in 2011, which is huge to think about. This allowed Nintendo to kind of see there was a market in the West for this kind of game, and they released the game over a staggered period of time. Again, translations take quite a while, especially for a big game like Xenoblade Chronicles. Xenoblade Chronicles follows the story of Shulk, a human living on the foot of a titan called the Bionis. His village is one day attacked by the evil race called the Mechon, who live on the titan right across from them, called Mechonis. During the attack, Shulk finds out he can wield an ancient legendary weapon called the Monado, and that Monado allows him to see into the future and defend his city. But after this attack, he sets out to discover the meaning of why the Mechon attacked and to stop the Mechon from ever attacking again and from ever hurting anybody again. Xenoblade was released to basically near universal acclaim, near perfect scores, and received several Game of the Year titles, and also beat financial expectations. To be blunt, Xenoblade Chronicles is probably one of the best games of all time. Better than Breath of the Wild, better than Witcher 3. I think Xenoblade Chronicles is probably one of the best games ever. It's probably not my favorite narrative. I don't think it's as complex as Xenogears, which is also, like I said, one of my favorite games, but Xenoblade Chronicles, just the sheer way you play this game, the sheer ability of going through these environments, of interacting, the combat, the story, everything, it's like the perfect blend of what a video game should be. And it is amazing to just play and to just experience. If you never played Xenoblade Chronicles, definitely pick up the Definitive Edition. It is an HD remaster of Xenoblade Chronicles, because the Wii was not in HD. Wii was, I believe, 720. It was easily the least powerful system, but Xenoblade Chronicles made a massive, believable world that is beautiful to explore, fun to play, and just a really moving story about fate and defeating fate. The kind of story the Kingdom Hearts series and the Final Fantasy series wanted to tell, but couldn't. And I recommend this game to literally everybody. It is amazing. Because of this huge success with Xenoblade, Xenoblade would enter into the Nintendo roster of, I guess, Kree franchises. I'm not sure how to explain it, but Xenoblade main character, Shulk, was added as a playable character in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. And if your character is added into Super Smash Bros., that means you're a real video game, and you're very important. With the release of Xenoblade in 2010, remember it released in 2010 in Japan, and it only came out in 2012 in America. In 2011, Takahashi kind of jumped straight into building what would become Xenoblade Chronicles X, or Xenoblade Chronicles Cross in Japan. The development of this game started when Takahashi approached Nintendo after the success of Xenoblade 1, asking about building a game based on Xenoblade 1's combat. Nintendo quickly approved of this idea and directed Takahashi towards their new console that was being developed, the infamous Wii U. Development of Xenoblade X saw the team deliberately mirroring Xenoblade 1's development in that they would kind of focus first and foremost on the combat and the environments, and then added the story later on. I think this is a very interesting way to do a Japanese RPG, because usually Japanese RPGs are known for their narrative first and foremost. They also make several interesting decisions, such as avoiding the cutting-edge technology of the time and trying to focus on how to make the game functional. This is pretty much the opposite of how the Western video game industry operates. Western video games always want graphics first and foremost, but Takahashi wanted to focus on a game that was playable and enjoyable. The decision to focus on functionality instead of cutting-edge graphics was because Xenoblade X would be Monolith Soft's first high-definition game, and Takahashi wanted to avoid hardware problems, especially since they were developing a new high-definition game on a new engine for a new system. Ko Kojima and Genki Yokata were brought back, who directed Xenoblade Chronicles 1. They were both brought back to develop Xenoblade Chronicles X as directors, and they also brought back Koichi Tanaka, who was, as you may remember, the character designer for Xenosaga and Xenogears. Takahashi would also hire multiple designers with very different styles to really flesh out the alien races that would appear in this game. The game was also tailored to hardcore fans of Xenoblade 1's combat, and it created a more complex and in-depth system that was hard to master, but once you knew how to master, you could easily break the game. And there's tons of videos on YouTube taking on bosses and enemies like twice their level. This decision to make a more hardcore combat system was also to encourage a more nuanced criticism of the game because he felt that Xenoblade Chronicles 1 did not get enough criticism, which is a very interesting approach because that received near universal acclaim, and most people say, wow, I'm really good at making video games, but Takahashi here was saying, man, I wonder if there's ways I can improve, and I hope to make something that people can really tell me how to improve on, which I really appreciate. Originally, Xenoblade Chronicles X wasn't going to have any online functionality, but Nintendo kind of stepped in later in the game's development to kind of build out what would become the PvE systems to make the world and cities feel less lonely. In Xenoblade Chronicles X, you can explore this massive planet, and in that planet you can kind of see other players running around, and you can also take on super bosses with your friends or even other people online to grind out enemies and dungeons and things like that. Xenoblade Chronicles X is also known for reintroducing mechs into the series. After Xenoblade Chronicles 1, there wasn't really any mechs outside of Mechonis. So this is really interesting. You can actually build your own robot mech and fly across the whole planet in your own robot mech seamlessly. It is what No Man's Sky wanted to do, but could not. But Takahashi with Xenoblade X was able to figure it out. Because of this open world mechanic, the size of the world proved to be a huge challenge for the development of this game, and the whole game barely fit onto the 32GB disc, and it made debugging a nightmare for Nintendo, and even for Monolith Soft. Takahashi also rehired the Xenoblade 1 writer, Yuichiro Takahata, alongside a new writer who worked on Gundam and various Gundam animes, named Kuzuho Yaohudo. Again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names. In order to build out the quests and stories of these characters, he hired these two writers again because he really wanted to encourage them to stay away from philosophical storytelling, and he really wanted to experiment with the world's open nature. He didn't want a big, narratively complex game in this already massive experimental open world game. So that's why he hired a Gundam writer and a guy that worked on the previous game with him, just so he can kind of keep things pretty simple. But because of the sudden switch to online mode late in the game's development, both writers kind of had to scramble to change from having a predetermined character, a predetermined character as in like Shulk, and move to a player avatar, like something you would create for an MMO, because suddenly this game was a pseudo MMO for Nintendo. You made your own avatar and you explored this huge open world and you took on quests with other people. Takahashi then made the very interesting decision to hire Haruhiko Suwano, known for his music on Attack on Titan and Kill la Kill. So Suwano's soundtrack was kind of criticized at first, but it's an excellent soundtrack actually. There's a lot of rap elements in it, and it is a super cool soundtrack. Again, it's a huge shift from what was the orchestral soundtrack of Xenoblade Chronicles 1, and the more symphonic, sci-fi-esque soundtracks of Xenosaga. In 2015, Xenoblade Chronicles X would release worldwide onto the Wii U. The story of Xenoblade Chronicles X follows the story of the human race entering into a war with an intergalactic alien empire called the Prone. During the attack, the Earth is destroyed and only a handful of ships escape with humans on board. One ship, which you're on, is called the White Whale, and it crashes onto an alien world called Mira. But during the crash, the ship loses its lifehold, which is supposed to be the kind of ark that holds all the ship's colonists and all the ship's civilians. So the ship crashes without the civilians and only the military personnel on top of it. This is where you come in and you make your own custom avatar to explore the planet and try to find other survivors and try to find the lifehold. And you also play with other characters, the most prominent of which is arguably the main character of Xenoblade X, named Elma. And you want to find the lifehold before the Prone do. And the basic gist of the story is that at this point you're going around the world, taking on quests, building relationships with other aliens, bringing them to your colony, and trying to fight the Prone. And it's a very simple story, but it is a very great game. The game sold about 200,000 copies on the Wii U, but a lot of online criticism was lobbed at the game for its localizations. Some of the stuff was censored at the time by Nintendo, such as swimsuits and even blood. And also the game's sudden shift to gameplay from story-driven to a more MMO-based system. Again, Xenoblade Chronicles was a big open world, but there was a narrative, but suddenly you had a very loose narrative tying everything together. It was much more like an MMO. Also, I remember from this time, there was a lot of online criticism about the game models, because again, Xenoblade Chronicles X was not looking to make cutting-edge graphics. But the game is generally praised for its really ambitious open world exploration, which I don't think has really been matched since. Xenoblade Chronicles X is an excellent game that is unfortunately placed onto the Wii U. Even though technically you can play with people, most of this online functionality takes place with you beating enemies in like a kind of dungeon, and it's not very complex in that regard, and you sometimes see people in the outside open world. But the main appeal of the game is building your own robot, flying around in that robot, and killing alien monsters, and exploring this frankly fascinating open world that is gorgeous to explore, with a really interesting soundtrack that is very in your face. It's a really cool game. I don't know if I would tell people to buy Wii to play it, but if it ever gets re-released, I will definitely recommend it. I really think it is probably one of the best open world games. It is very different than how Witcher 3 plays, which is also an open world game, in that it is really all about exploration. You have a lot of nook and crannies in the environment, while Witcher 3 is very much about going from a point A to a point B, and the environment is pretty, but you're not really exploring the map in any visible way. So after Xenoblade Chronicles X, Monolith Soft had a very close relationship with Nintendo, and they would kind of begin this really weird relationship where they were kind of the debuggers for Nintendo, and they really helped develop a lot of their more complex games for what would become the Switch. For example, because Monolith Soft built Xenoblade Chronicles X, which is a huge open world game, bigger than I think even maybe The Witcher 3, Monolith Soft helped Nintendo build out some of the more complex games like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Kind of infamously, Xenoblade Chronicles Hex has a hexagonal system where you explore the game in a grid-like system, but that allowed Monolith Soft to really easily debug the game, because in each area they can kind of put notes to each other about what they found, what worked, what didn't work, what they might add. And they were able to bring that over to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I believe there are some videos on YouTube showing the debugging mode of Breath of the Wild. You can kind of see this note system throughout that game. And it's a really ingenious way of debugging big open world games, of being able to just leave big text messages for your other fellow programmers to kind of find and fix very quickly, and even just point them in the right direction. So Monolith Soft was here helping Nintendo with Breath of the Wild, Splatoon, Super Mario Odyssey, and really becoming a big in-game studio for Nintendo. But very quickly after the end of Xenoblade Chronicles X, they kind of headed straight long into the production of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. As soon as Xenoblade Chronicles X ended, they basically went straight into Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and they took a lot of that initial criticism of why is this game an open world, why isn't it more narrative based, and they kind of laser focus on that for Xenoblade Chronicles 2. This time, with all this experience from all these open world games, Takahashi took a lead writing position this time, instead of being an executive producer and kind of a pseudo head director of everybody. And he took this lead writing position over Hayato and Takada, who were also the writers on Xenoblade Chronicles X. And he developed the general story, while Hayato and Takada made the individual chapters. So he made the big outline, and they did the individual pieces. Because of this, Takada described the story as the one with the most Takahashi flair to date. Very little of the staff changed between games, and because of this, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 kind of went straight into development, and it developed very quickly. They were able to get things off the floor fast. One of the bigger new additions was the addition of lead character designer Masatsugo Saito, who is known for the sci-fi anime Expelled from Paradise, which is kind of a weird virtual anime. It deals a lot in 3D models, it was kind of experimental for its time, about robots and aliens and things like that. He is kind of a perfect writer and character designer for this, but he's kind of known for very lewd, horny designs, and that translates a lot into the game's characters. But this game also had a lot of guest designers too, with one of the biggest ones being Tetsuya Nomura, who is known for designing and building the Kingdom Hearts franchise and Final Fantasy 15, 13, Final Fantasy 7 Remake. He is a superstar in terms of character design and just video game development in general. And Nomura designed all the villains in the game, while Saito built all the main characters, all the lead characters. And he makes some very interesting designs, but basically all his characters have huge boobs. And Nomura doesn't. All his characters are very fashionable, and surprisingly, they do not have zippers or pockets. It's frankly jarring. Takahashi also hired a lot of other designers to build out what the game's roster would be. In the game, you can kind of get these unique characters called blades. I'll get into the gameplay in a second, but he hired a lot of designers to make the design for individual blades in the game. Some of them from anime like Code Geass, Gundam. He brought back his wife Saga to build a couple characters. It's a lot of varied designs in the game, and I think it makes the game very enjoyable to collect. One of the most notable people he brought back was Tanaka to design a new cosmos for the game. Alongside Tanaka, they would also hire back Masuda, who made the soundtrack for Xenogears and Xenosaga, to do the soundtrack for this game. Because of how much the game was built upon Xenoblade Chronicles X, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 pretty quickly launched straight onto the Nintendo Switch, and it was helped along by the pressure of being a launch title for Nintendo Switch. So, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 launched worldwide on December 1st, 2017, with its expansion DLC called Torna the Golden Country, released a year later. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 would become the highest selling game of this meta franchise, selling around 1.73 million copy. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is part of the reason I made this whole podcast, because I have a lot of mixed feelings on Xenoblade Chronicles 2. But Xenoblade Chronicles 2 really deviates from what I enjoyed about pretty much the last 6 games. Its story is very back and forth. There's a lot of very strange moments in the game, and I don't think it does as good of a job of exploring themes about God and religion and things like that. For me, I think Xenoblade 2 is generally a downgrade from Xenoblade 1 and Xenoblade X. Much of the game is based around that each environment you explore is a separate area, while in Xenoblade Chronicles X, everything was connected. And in Xenoblade Chronicles 1, each area was connected to one another. There was a loading screen for each area, but each area was connected into one bigger world. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 decided to take each area and just make it its own, I guess, kind of world, because in the lore of the game, everybody lives on these titans, and these titans are very self-contained. So it makes this weird instance where a lot of the environments feel very small, and I don't think a lot of the environments feel very unique. You have like a desert titan, a snow titan, a forest titan. There's not a whole lot of variety, where Xenoblade Chronicles 1 was really able to spice things up by like creating a lot of really weird nooks and crannies in each of the areas that made things really cool. For example, in Galward Plains, which is one of the first areas to explore in Xenoblade Chronicles 1, there's a lot of like rivers and waterfalls you can kind of sneak behind and explore. And Xenoblade Chronicles 2 doesn't really have that, and it's kind of frustrating. Because of how small these environments are, it really like kind of screws with enemy placement. You have a lot of like high level enemies in the middle of kind of like packs that you could take on. They can very easily accidentally pull like a level 80 monster or something. And it also deals away with a lot of the more complex systems of Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and X. For example, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has like a town system, and that you can kind of develop each town, which is something both X and 1 had. But Xenoblade Chronicles 2, town system is very odd in that you build out the town by simply just buying things and occasionally doing quests, but you don't see any noticeable change within the town itself. In 1 and X, you saw a lot of change as you played the game. Like in X, aliens moved into the city and they kind of made their own little areas within the city. In 1, you could see characters literally like moving from one town to another. And you saw these towns get built out and expanded upon. And Xenoblade 2 doesn't really have that, oddly enough, and I'm not sure why they did away with that. But between like kind of the isolated environments that don't feel very unique, the kind of town system, the two biggest things I think a lot of people complain about, and what I kind of complain about, is that Xenoblade 2 combat is kind of hard to enjoy. I think there's a lot of in-depth mechanics to Xenoblade 2, but the way it's fundamentally built is that each action builds upon one another. The consequence of this is that Xenoblade 2 combat is extremely slow, especially at lower level. Because the idea is that here, how it works in Xenoblade 2 is that you auto-attack. And then when you auto-attack, every hit you do adds a counter to your special moves. It's like a mana system. You hit something, you get 1 point of mana. And once you have 4 points of mana, you're able to use your spell. The more you use your spells, you can use your special. And each special has a special element depending on your equipment. And if you chain your specials well, you're able to build a special combo. I believe is called an elemental combo. And once you have an elemental combo going, you can kind of chain those elemental combos on top of each other to debuff your enemy. And eventually you can kind of stack all these debuffs on top of your enemy and then pop them all at once. And the more debuffs you pop at once, you do a special move to trigger these debuffs. It's called a chain attack. The more debuffs you trigger at once, the more damage you do, and there's a damage multiplier. Again, at that point it's already complex and it's very layered. But the problem is so layered that if you're not auto-attacking fast, the game is painfully slow. And it's a problem too because you'll be sometimes triple the level of an enemy and it will take a good 30 seconds to kill that enemy. Even though you're triple the level, you should be able to kill in 1 or 2 hits, but in the game it takes 15 seconds because you gotta wait for everybody to warm up and kill the enemy. And it's annoying in the late game of this. The combo system, the layer system is very intricate and it releases some very interesting combat that's really cool, but it takes so long to get there. And that leads me to my next big problem with the game is that in order to get new specials, you get this equipment called blades. And blades are kind of like Pokemon you collect throughout the game. Each blade has its own specials, its own moves, kind of like Pokemon. You're collecting things, and the more things you collect, the more options you have. The fundamental problem with this is that all the blades you collect in Xenoblade 2 are randomized. You just want 1 or 2 blades you really want to play with, but you can't get them because the way to get them is randomized because you have to farm crystals and then you use these crystals to get new blades. But the crystals are randomized each time. So it makes this really hard to enjoy in that regard. And then I also don't I also don't really like the story of this because I feel like it has a lot of whiplash in it. One of the bigger examples is that in, I believe, the second area, no, the third area. Yeah, the third area is more ordained. So you go to this desert area and you're exploring and then you kind of get into this complicated, I guess, political struggle. It involves somebody dying. There's a lot of death, a lot of characters are suddenly sad. Then you could go into this new area and you're fighting robot maids. And the crux of the story at that point in this whole area is that there's a guy building an army of robot maids. So you have to stop this guy from building an army of robot maids. And the final boss of that area is a giant robot maid that he's piloting. And there's a good 2-minute sequence where it's kind of like a Sailor Moon-esque parody where the robot is transforming into a more beautiful version. And it's just what the... I don't know what's going on. I'm getting whiplash. And that's throughout the entire game. I got really frustrated by the end of it because a lot of the characters' motivations were kind of weird. They weren't bad, but everybody was sympathetic for some reason, even though you had a lot of people, hundreds and thousands of people, then suddenly you're supposed to feel bad for them. And it just felt really weird, the character motivations compared to the kind of complex motivations of previous games. I generally did not enjoy the story of this game. Didn't super enjoy the combat, and didn't super enjoy the exploration. I feel in general this entire game is a downgrade. But it sold really well, so I think your mileage varies on it, but a lot of the criticisms seem to echo what I say in that people are frustrated with how slow it feels in the beginning, and they're frustrated with the randomized mechanics of the game. My biggest disappointment was the environments. I didn't really expect a super complex story after Xenoblade Chronicles X, but the exploration in this was very lackluster. The environments were just not good. So after the success of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Monolith Soft kind of split into 2 different production teams. One allegedly working on a new fantasy game, and another one allegedly working on a new Legend of Zelda title. But this is back in 2018, and with everything that's been happening in the world, I wouldn't be surprised if something changes if one team gets axed or the other one gets melded into another team. Who knows? Right now, it's not really known if there will be more entries into the Xeno series. because right now they only released the definitive edition of Xenoblade Chronicles 1 on the Nintendo Switch. And that was probably like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I think it's one of the best games and you should buy it. I think the story of these games is really interesting because you can kind of see the history of a fairly recent video game development, going from very narratively complex games to a bit more gameplay focused and focusing less on story and streamlining and accessibility. Again, that's not the story of all gaming, but I think it's interesting to see how, across the whole breadth of this meta series, Takahashi really saw something special in his series, in his games, and he really wanted to bring that out. But that's really the end of the story. I really do hope they eventually come back to the more narratively complex games of Xenogears and Xenosagas. I kind of doubt it now that they're working with Nintendo, and Takahashi's wife, Saga, doesn't really seem to be writing anymore, which I think is a big shame. I really do hope they come back to the big narratives that they had, because that's the parts I really enjoyed. But hopefully if them working on a Legend of Zelda title says anything, I think that means Nintendo trusts Takahashi with pushing Nintendo forward. Because, oddly enough, Takahashi, who is not super well known in the West, has been developing the open world mechanics for the East in Japan, and kind of taking the video game industry and the Japanese video game industry, which was at first what he was leading was narrative, and now he's leading gameplay. And I think that shift is something that is interesting to me. I really appreciate what Takahashi has done throughout this entire series, and he really made some very interesting games. Beautiful games, along with his creative team. And Takahashi is an extraordinarily talented man, and you can kind of see that in how he's been given chance and chance again from very high off people to make these lofty games and really fulfill his lofty idea. And that's something like when I was researching this, like it's kind of inspiring to see that there was this man who came up with this complex idea and he was able to manifest it into reality. I really appreciate Takahashi. I really appreciate everything he's done for the video game industry, even though you don't feel it right now in the West. And I hope these games influence game design over here, and not just in the East. So that concludes my entire discussion on the Xeno meta series. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I didn't pronounce too many names throughout of this. You can follow us on Dissecting Fiction on all your favorite social media websites. We're on Instagram, Vero, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We even have a YouTube page where we upload these videos onto the platform, all these podcasts and everything. Follow us. We hopefully have some more things for everybody in the future. Right now we are doing a Man of Steel episode and a Batman vs. Superman episode, which Vinny is really excited for. He really loves those movies. You can follow us and see when those are getting released along with this episode on all our social media platforms. So this has been an exploration of the incredible Xeno meta series. I'm Christiaan, and this has been a Dissecting Fiction podcast.